My son, Sean Gallagher, stood at the front of his restaurant on the night of his grand opening. A room full of investors and strangers watching him, and told everyone that his mother's fear had held him back for years. Not Tara Weston, the woman who had spent months whispering into his ear about luxury positioning and brand identity. Not the debt compounding quietly behind every polished surface in that dining room. Me, his mother. The woman who had cashed in Donald's life insurance, worked double shifts at the vocational college in Scarborough, and driven the same dented Civic for 11 years so my son's dream could have a fighting chance. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of any of them. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table, collected my coat from the rack by the door, and walked out into the February cold. And the next morning, I stopped every single payment connected to Ash and Ember. If you have ever given someone everything you had and watched them use it against you, you already know the particular kind of tired I felt that night. Donald Gallagher used to say that Toronto in winter had a way of sorting people out. The cold, he said, made everything honest. You either had a warm place to go, or you didn't, and pretending otherwise was impossible when the temperature dropped below -15. After 34 years of marriage, I believed him completely. Donald died of a stroke 18 months before Sean opened his restaurant. He was 68 years old, still strong in his hands and slow in the mornings, still making pancakes from scratch every Sunday the way he had since before Sean was born. He died on a Tuesday in March while shoveling the front walk, which was so like him. Stubborn about accepting help, convinced he could manage anything if he moved steadily enough. He left me our semi-detached in East York, a modest retirement fund, and a life insurance policy that was not large but was enough to keep me careful. That word, careful, had defined most of my adult life. I packed lunches. I bought winter coats in March when they went on sale. I kept Donald's old toolbox in the garage, because parting with it felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. Sean was our only child. He had Donald's stubbornness, and my particular way of going still and quiet when he was working through something important. From the time he was small, he was drawn to the kitchen. Not as a hobby, the way some children are drawn to baking for an afternoon. As something essential. He cooked the way Donald built furniture, with patience and a focused attention that made everything else in the room irrelevant. He studied culinary arts in Ottawa, spent a year working prep at a restaurant in Vancouver, that got written up in every food publication that mattered, and came home to Toronto the summer after Donald died. He moved back into his childhood bedroom for a few months, and during that time we cooked together most evenings, working through Donald's old recipes, laughing at the margin notes my husband had left in his worn spiral-bound cookbook. Donald had strong opinions about everything. The margins were full of them. I think those months were the closest Sean and I had been since he was a teenager. Then one October evening he sat across from me at the kitchen table, with a folder of photographs and a look on his face I recognized immediately. It was the look Donald used to get before he said something that would cost us money. "Mum," Sean said, "I think I've found the space." He showed me photographs of a narrow Victorian building on Dundas Street West. High ceilings, exposed brick, the kind of bones that take decades to earn. The kitchen needed new equipment and the dining room required a complete overhaul, but the structure was sound. He had been back 3 times already to stand in it and think. He wanted to call it Ash and Ember. When he said it, he looked almost shy. I thought of Donald sitting at that same table, drawing floor plans for a deck he'd spent 3 summers building. That particular shyness, the kind that means a person is showing you something they genuinely love. I had only ever seen it on Donald's face before that moment. "Tell me what you need," I said. I want to be clear about the choices I made in the months that followed. I was not deceived into them. I knew what I was spending, and I chose it because watching my son's face fall and telling him the money was somewhere I wouldn't reach felt worse than the numbers themselves. I paid the security deposit and the first 4 months of commercial rent. I funded a portion of the kitchen equipment through a supplier Sean had researched carefully. I helped cover the contractor fees for the dining room renovation, which Donald would have done himself in half the time, and at a quarter of the cost. Every check I wrote, Sean hugged me and said, "I won't forget this, Mum." And I believed him. I was proud in the way parents become proud before they learn to be cautious. Tara Weston appeared in January, about 6 weeks after the renovation began. The first time Sean brought her to the restaurant, while I was there helping sort linen deliveries, she walked in wearing an expensive camel coat and carrying a leather portfolio that looked as though it had never touched a shelf. She was polished and confident in the way that fills a room before a person even speaks. Sean introduced her with a brightness in his voice I associated with excitement he hadn't yet processed. "Mum, this is Tara. She's been consulting on restaurant launches across the city for years. She's going to help us with the concept rollout." Tara shook my hand warmly. "Sean talks about you constantly," she said. "You should be so proud of what he's building here." At the time, I thought it sounded generous. Looking back, I noticed she didn't call me his mother first. Within 3 weeks, I heard her name before almost every sentence my son spoke. "Tara says the menu needs to feel more elevated. Tara says the signage reads too neighborhood. We need something that signals upscale from the street. Tara says serious reviewers look at the wine list before anything else, and ours reads like a bistro, not a destination." I told myself Tara knew the industry. I told myself Sean was building something, and I was the one who didn't understand how these things worked. But the original Ash and Ember, the one Sean had described to me at the kitchen table, had been something else entirely. He had talked about a neighborhood place, about food that made people feel like they were eating something their grandmother would have been proud to serve, about local suppliers and seasonal menus, and a dining room warm enough to make Torontonians forget it was -20 outside. What I watched taking shape on Dundas Street West was nothing like that description. The exposed brick disappeared behind a steel and plaster installation. The warm lighting Sean had chosen was replaced with something colder and more angular. The hand-lettered menu boards came down. Everything became sharper, more expensive looking, and less like my son. I kept writing checks because I did not know how to stop. One evening, I arrived at the restaurant with dinner from the Thai place on the corner because I knew Sean hadn't been eating properly. I set the containers down in the kitchen and went looking for him. I heard his voice from the back office and paused near the doorway when I realized he was on the phone. "She means well," he was saying quietly. "But she doesn't actually understand what we're building. Tara gets it. Mum just sees the money going out." The sentence landed without witnesses, which is the particular cruelty of moments like that. There was nobody in the hallway to watch me go still against the wall. I left the Thai food on the counter and drove home in the dark. I told myself for 3 days that I had misunderstood the context. I am a woman who has spent 64 years making excuses for the people I love, and I was still very much in practice. The money requests grew larger and came more frequently. $12,000 for a launch event at a venue in the distillery district. $4,000 for a food photographer whose name Tara had apparently mentioned in some influential context. $7,000 for a public relations consultant who, as far as I could tell, spent most of her time posting photographs of Sean looking serious in a chef's coat. One Sunday afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to add up everything I had given since the project began. My hands were slightly unsteady by the time I reached the total. It was not a small number. That evening, Sean came for dinner and brought Tara. Dev Nakamura, his old friend from culinary school who had invested a smaller amount in the restaurant at the beginning, arrived separately and sat quietly near the window. Dev had always been thoughtful in a way that operated below the surface. That evening, his silence felt deliberate. Dinner started gently enough. Then Tara reached into her leather portfolio and produced a document she placed in the center of the table with the casual authority of someone accustomed to controlling the direction of rooms. It was a proposal for a private dining room expansion and a second kitchen station for events. The expansion would cost approximately $95,000. I set the document down carefully. "Sean," I said, "you haven't opened yet." Tara answered before he could. "That's exactly why this is the right moment. You build the infrastructure before the audience arrives, not after." "And the funding?" I asked. Sean looked at the table briefly before answering. "The bank will approve it if there's additional security on the application." He paused. They'd want the East York house. Donald's house. The house I had agreed to buy because the backyard was large enough for a workshop. And Donald had spent the better part of a decade building things in that workshop that people still used. Sean's childhood bedroom was still Sean's bedroom. Donald's toolbox was still in the garage. No, I said. Sean's expression changed immediately. You didn't even read the full proposal. I read enough of it. This is exactly what Tara said would happen, he muttered. Something cold moved through me. What does that mean? Tara set her fork down gently. I only mention that parents sometimes struggle to separate personal attachment from business investment. I looked at her steadily for a moment. I'm sure you did. Dev spoke for the first time all evening, very quietly. Maybe this isn't the right night for this. Nobody listened to him. Sean leaned forward. You've supported me this far. Why does it stop now? Because you're asking me to risk the last thing your father left us. The word father landed in the room and stayed there. Sean looked away immediately. Tara redirected with practiced smoothness, mentioning the projected return timeline, but I had already stopped listening to her. I was looking at Dev across the table, and Dev was looking at his plate with the expression of a person who knows something he hasn't yet decided to say. I drove home in the dark for the second time that winter. The night of the grand opening arrived in February the way February always arrives in Toronto. Without apology. With ice on the sidewalks and a sky the color of old concrete. Ash and Ember had been mentioned in 2 local food blogs and 1 national restaurant column before it had served a single paying customer. Tara had earned those mentions, I supposed, whatever she had charged for earning them. I wore the navy dress I had bought for Donald's retirement dinner 4 years earlier. Standing at the mirror before I left, I looked like myself in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not older, just honest. The dining room was beautiful. I will say that honestly, because it was. The tables were set with heavy linen and small candles, and the kitchen smelled the way Sean's food had always smelled, like something that understood what comfort meant. For one moment, standing near the entrance before the room filled, I felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with money. Then the room filled. Tara arrived, looking as though she had been dressed specifically to be photographed, which she was, constantly, by someone she had arranged to be there for that purpose. She found me near the bar within 10 minutes. Sean needs a decision on the expansion application by end of week, she said pleasantly. The bank window closes. He knows where I stand, I told her. He was hoping tonight might change things. Then he misunderstood tonight. She smiled and moved away. Sean gave a short speech at the midpoint of the evening. He thanked his kitchen team. He thanked Dev. He thanked Tara by name at length, with evident warmth. Then he looked out at the room and said something about how building Ash and Ember had taught him that real support meant trusting someone's vision even when it frightened you, and that the people in his life who had held him back with their worry had ultimately made him fight harder. He did not look at me when he said it. He did not have to. The room applauded. I stood against the far wall, holding a glass of sparkling water, invisible in the way that people become invisible, when they are simply expected to be grateful for the opportunity to be present. Later, Tara brought a folder to a small table near the back where Dev and I had been standing. She placed it in front of me without asking. Sean appeared beside her a moment later. His eyes were bright from the evening, and from whatever he had let himself believe about how this night was going. Mum, he said quietly, please. No, Sean. His expression shifted in the way that takes years to stop hurting a parent. You never believed this would work. You've been waiting for it to fail since the beginning. I believed in you. I'm not sure I believe in every decision you've made. That's the same thing. His voice rose just slightly, enough that the nearest couples paused their conversations without visibly doing so. I built something here, and all you've done for months is wait for it to fall apart. You can't stand the idea that I did this. I helped you do this, I said quietly. And now you're taking it back because you can't let me succeed without your permission. I looked at my son standing in the restaurant I had helped build, beside a woman I did not trust, saying things I suspected someone had taught him to say, and I felt something shift inside me that had been shifting for a long time. "I hope someday you understand what you said tonight," I told him. I collected my coat from the rack and walked out into the February cold. By 4 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table in Donald's old cardigan with my laptop open, looking at every automatic transfer I had set up for Ash and Ember over the previous 8 months. There were more than I had tracked carefully. Marketing installments, supplier prepayments, software subscriptions, monthly transfers to a consulting account I had not examined closely. I canceled every one of them before sunrise. Then, I drafted a message to Sean, telling him I would not provide further financial support until I had reviewed complete accounting records and that I was requesting documentation related to all consulting fees paid during the build period. His response was a phone call I did not answer, followed by a voicemail in which he said I was punishing him for succeeding, and that Tara had warned him something like this might happen. That sentence, Tara warned him, was the one that finally made me call Lois. Lois Chambers had been my closest friend since we had served on the same school board parent council when our children were in primary school. She was a retired accountant and the least sentimental person I knew. When I told her everything, all of it from the first check to the voicemail, she came over that afternoon with her reading glasses and a no-nonsense steadiness I had been needing for months. We sat at the kitchen table for nearly 3 hours with every invoice and bank statement I could find. By the end, Lois had organized the documents into 3 neat piles and was looking at me over the rims of her glasses with an expression equal parts sympathy and alarm. "Have you ever heard of a company called Weston Hospitality Group?" she asked. I hadn't. Lois turned her laptop toward me. The company was registered in Ontario, less than 2 years old, principal director listed as Tara Weston. Most of the largest consulting invoices connected to Ash and Ember had been paid directly to that company. "She's billing Sean's restaurant," I said slowly. "She's billing you," Lois corrected. "You've been the primary source of operating capital." The invoices listed services like concept elevation consulting, hospitality brand immersion, and investor positioning strategy. The language was designed to be opaque. Some of the individual payments were large enough to have funded a full month of kitchen payroll. "This is predatory," Lois said flatly. The more she convinced Sean to spend, the more she earned. She profits whether this restaurant succeeds or not. 2 days later, Dev Nakamura came to my door. He stood on the porch in his winter coat, looking like a man who had not slept well and had decided to do something uncomfortable about it. I made tea and listened while he laid out what he had found after pulling his own investment documentation. The financial structure of Ash and Ember was worse than I had imagined. The credit line was significantly drawn. Several supplier accounts were past due. The payroll account had run dangerously low twice since December, and buried in a consulting agreement. Addendum. Tara had drafted the previous autumn was a clause granting her company the right to participate in any debt restructuring decisions if the restaurant's primary investors became financially non-viable. She structured herself in, Dev said. If things deteriorate far enough, she has a legal foothold in whatever happens to the assets. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, snow had begun falling again over East York. The slow February kind that settles without urgency. "Does Sean know this clause exists?" I asked. Dev looked at his tea. "I don't think Sean has carefully read most of what he's signed." A young woman named Amy Briggs came to see me later that week. She had worked the floor at Ash and Ember during the soft launch period and had left quietly the month before. She was in her mid-20s and sat on the edge of my sofa like someone who had talked herself into coming and was still not entirely sure she should have. At first, she said, Sean had been wonderful to work for, generous and genuinely invested in his staff. Then Tara had started running the front-of-house meetings. Amy described how Tara had instructed the serving staff to tell guests certain menu items were unavailable when they weren't, in order to create the impression of scarcity. She mentioned an incident in which Tara had pressured Sean to overorder a wine shipment that arrived before opening and sat in a corridor because there wasn't room in the cellar. She said kitchen wages had been delayed twice, both times with apologies from Sean that sounded practiced. "He knew things weren't right," Amy said carefully. I think he just couldn't let himself look directly at it. After she left, I went to the hall closet and reached up to the high shelf where I kept a shoebox of Donald's things. Not the legal documents, not the important papers, but the small things. His reading glasses, a transit token from when we'd visited Vancouver the year before he got sick, and his spiral-bound recipe book, the one he'd kept since before Sean was born. Every page in Donald's careful handwriting, the margins full of notes and revisions, and the occasional firm editorial comment about his own cooking. I had not opened it in months. I sat with it in the armchair by the window while snow fell outside and turned the pages slowly. The Sunday pancake recipe was near the front, annotated in 3 different ink colors as Donald updated it across the years. Further in were notes he had made after watching Sean cook something complicated during a visit home from Vancouver. Proud observations, curious questions, suggestions his son had probably never known were there. Near the back, I found something I had forgotten about. Donald had started writing a letter to Sean 6 months before he died. It was not a goodbye letter. It was more like the kind of thing he did. A running conversation with someone he loved started on a Tuesday afternoon when he had something to say and no reason to think he wouldn't finish it later. The letter was 3 pages in Donald's clear, unhurried handwriting. The last line was unfinished, interrupted by whatever had called him away from the table that afternoon. He wrote about the years he had spent building furniture in the garage. Not for income at first, though it became that, but because making something from raw material was the most honest work he knew. He wrote about the time he had been approached by a larger shop to take on a business partner, who had turned out to want Donald's client list and reputation more than any genuine collaboration. He wrote about having been naive about it, and embarrassed afterward, and about learning, slowly and with some difficulty, that confident people who arrive offering exactly what you most need to hear are sometimes the ones who deserve the most careful examination. Then he wrote about Sean. "You have the real thing in you, son. I've watched you cook since you were tall enough to reach the counter. You don't need anyone to make you look more legitimate than you already are. The work speaks. Trust the work, not the person telling you the work isn't enough on its own." I pressed my hand flat against the page and stayed very still for a long time. Rebecca Fowler, my attorney, arranged a meeting 3 weeks later in a boardroom on King Street. Lois came with me. Tara arrived with her own legal counsel, which told me everything I needed to know about how well she had been preparing for this. Rebecca walked through the financial documentation, methodically and without drama. When she reached the consulting fee structure, the percentages tied to spending volume, the escalating invoices, the restructuring clause, she placed the documents in the center of the table without commentary and waited. Tara's counsel spoke first, about standard industry practice. Rebecca responded about fiduciary responsibility and the particular obligations that arise when a consultant is operating within a family-funded startup and is simultaneously the primary beneficiary of that startup's expenditure growth. Tara herself remained composed throughout until Rebecca slid a single document across the table and asked her to explain her involvement in its preparation. It was a supplemental liability waiver that appeared to carry my signature, authorizing expanded financial exposure for ash and ember operations. I had never seen it before in my life. The signature looked like mine, close enough to be convincing at a glance, and not close enough to survive scrutiny. Sean, who had been sitting with his hands flat on the table for most of the meeting, looked at the document and then looked at Tara. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "It went through the standard document process," she said evenly. "What standard process? My mother signs things I bring her in person, always." The silence that followed lasted long enough to become something else entirely. I watched my son's face change, not quickly, the way understanding sometimes comes, slowly at first, then all at once, like ice finally giving way underfoot. He pushed his chair back slightly and looked at the table. When he looked up at Tara, his expression was not angry. It was the face of someone who has stopped protecting a belief they held longer than the evidence supported. "I'd like to speak with my mother alone," he said. We stepped into the corridor. The hallway was all glass and gray winter light. The city spread quietly below us in the afternoon. Sean didn't speak immediately. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at the floor the way he used to as a teenager, when he was working out how to apologize for something. "I called you afraid," he said finally, "in my speech." "Yes. I've been saying versions of that for months." He closed his eyes briefly. "Every time I defended the spending, I needed it to be your fear that was the problem, not mine." I waited. "She made me feel like I couldn't have gotten this far without her guidance." He said it quietly, to the floor. "And I wanted that to be true, because if it was true, then all of it made sense." "The restaurant makes sense," I said. "You make sense. The rest of it didn't." He looked up then. His eyes were red at the edges in the way they had gone since he was a boy, when something had genuinely broken through. "I said terrible things to you, in front of people." "You did." He exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to fix that." "You can't fix it," I said. "You can do better." He nodded once carefully. Tara Weston settled privately. The restructuring clause was voided, and the final consulting invoices were substantially reduced. Whether the signature matter would be pursued further remained open as of that spring. Ash and Ember closed for 6 weeks and reopened with a quieter dining room, warmer, closer to the restaurant Sean had first described to me at the kitchen table in East York. Dev stayed involved. The menu changed with the season. A food columnist from a local neighborhood paper came in March and wrote something genuinely kind about the lamb. Sean called me on a Sunday in April and asked if I would come for dinner. I drove west along Dundas Street in the early evening with Donald's recipe book on the passenger seat. When I walked in, the dining room was not yet open for service, and Sean was alone in the kitchen doing prep, the way he had been born to do. He looked up when he heard the door, and something in his face settled when he saw me. The particular settling that happens when a person stops needing to perform. He made dinner in a quiet kitchen, nothing elaborate, and we ate at a small table near the window. He told me about the menu changes. I told him about a leak in the garage roof I'd been putting off fixing. We talked about Donald for a while, and I brought out the recipe book and set it on the table between us. Sean read the letter slowly. When he reached the last unfinished line, he stayed with it for a long moment. His jaw was tight in the way Donald's used to be when he was keeping himself together. "He knew," Sean said finally. "Not about Tara, or the money, or any of the specifics. Just that his father had understood something important, and had tried to say it while there was still time." "He always knew you better than you gave him credit for," I said. Sean set the book down carefully, the way he would set down something he did not want to damage. Then he looked at me across the small table, and for the first time since any of this had begun, he looked like himself. "I'm sorry, Mum." I reached across and put my hand over his the way I had when he was small, and frightened by something he didn't yet have language for. "I know," I said. Outside, the last of the winter was finally letting go. The street was still gray, but it was the particular gray of early spring, the one that comes just before the city remembers how to be warm again. Families survive terrible things, not cleanly, not without lasting marks, but they survive when people are willing to stop protecting a false version of events and start being honest about the true one. Sean and I were not the same after that winter. Some of what we had lost did not come back. Trust does not return all at once. It comes back slowly, through small and ordinary things, a shared meal, an honest answer, choosing to show up again after you had every reason not to. Winter. It makes everything honest. You either come through it together or you don't, and there is no polite way to pretend otherwise. When the cold finally lets up and you are standing there in the thaw. We came through it, that is enough.